Sarah Martinez pressed her face against the cold window of the Greyhound bus as it rolled through the mountains of Montana. The year was 1943, and, at 17 years old, she was traveling alone to her grandfather's ranch after her parents died in a factory accident in Detroit. Everything she owned fit into 2 worn suitcases, including the thing that would change everything, her great-grandfather's hunting rifle, wrapped carefully in an old quilt. The rifle was a 1928 Winchester Model 54, passed down through 3 generations of her family. It had belonged to her great-grandfather Miguel, who brought it with him when he immigrated from Mexico in 1920. The wood stock was scratched and weathered, the metal showed spots of rust despite careful cleaning, and the scope was an old fixed-power model that had seen better days. Most people who saw it would call it junk, but Sarah knew better. Miguel had taught her father to shoot with that rifle, and her father had taught her. When the bus finally stopped in Pine Ridge, a small town with more horses than cars, Sarah gathered her belongings and stepped into the crisp mountain air. Her grandfather, Roberto Martinez, was waiting beside an old Ford pickup truck. He was a small man with calloused hands and kind eyes, wearing clothes that had seen years of hard work on the ranch. "Mija," he said, embracing her. "I'm sorry about your parents. But you're home now." Home. Sarah had never lived on a ranch before, but something about the endless sky and rolling hills felt familiar, like a memory passed down through her blood. The Martinez Ranch covered 5,000 acres of rugged terrain, home to cattle, horses, and wildlife. Roberto ran it with the help of 2 hired hands, Tom Bradley, a local man in his 30s who had worked the ranch for 8 years, and Jake Morrison, a young man from town who helped part-time. Both men were friendly enough when they met Sarah, but she could see the skepticism in their eyes. A teenage girl from the city, what could she possibly know about ranch life? Sarah's first few weeks were a struggle. She learned to milk cows, mend fences, and ride horses. Her hands blistered, her back ached, and she made mistakes that cost time and money. Tom and Jake were patient but clearly doubted she would last long. They weren't cruel about it, just realistic. Ranch life was hard, and most city folks didn't have what it took. One evening after a particularly difficult day of trying to herd stubborn cattle, Sarah sat on the porch cleaning her great-grandfather's rifle. Tom and Jake were sitting nearby, sharing a beer and talking about the day's work. "That's quite a piece you got there," Tom said, noticing the rifle. "Mind if I take a look?" Sarah hesitated, then handed it over. Tom examined it with the careful eye of someone who knew firearms. "Winchester Model 54, he said. "These were good rifles in their day, but this one's seen better times. Look at this stock all dinged up. And this scope, it's older than my grandmother." Jake took his turn examining it. "My dad's got one of the new Model 70s. Now that's a hunting rifle. This thing looks like it belongs in a museum." "It still shoots straight," Sarah said quietly. "I'm sure it does, honey," Tom replied with a patronizing smile. "But shooting straight and hunting in these mountains are 2 different things. You need a rifle that can handle long distances, changing weather, tough conditions. This old gun might be good for shooting cans in the backyard, but out here?" He shook his head. Sarah felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and anger, but she said nothing. She took the rifle back and continued cleaning it in silence. Over the following weeks, the comments continued. Not maliciously, but with the casual dismissiveness of men who assumed they knew better. When Sarah mentioned wanting to help with the upcoming elk hunt that would provide meat for the winter, Tom chuckled. "You ever hunt elk, Sarah? They're not like the deer back east. These are big animals, sometimes 800 pounds or more. You need a rifle that can drop them clean with one shot from 300 yards. That old Winchester of yours might wound one, and then we'd have a dangerous, angry animal to track through the wilderness." Plus, Jake added, elk hunting isn't for beginners. It takes years to learn the mountains, understand the weather, read the signs. Maybe you should stick to helping with the cattle for now. Roberto watched these interactions with growing frustration. He had known his great-granddaughter Sarah was special from the moment she arrived. She worked harder than many men he'd hired over the years, never complained, and learned quickly. He also knew something the others didn't: Sarah could shoot. One afternoon while Tom and Jake were in town getting supplies, Roberto took Sarah to a makeshift shooting range he'd set up in a meadow behind the ranch house. "Show me what that rifle can do, Mija," he said. Sarah loaded the old Winchester with careful, practiced movements. Roberto had set up targets at various distances: 100 yards, 200 yards, and 300 yards. The longest target was barely visible, a small square of cardboard tacked to a fence post. Sarah took her time, adjusting the rifle's position, accounting for the slight breeze, controlling her breathing just as her father had taught her. She fired 5 shots at each distance. When they walked out to check the targets, Roberto whistled low. At 100 yards, all 5 shots were within a 2-inch circle. At 200 yards, they were within 4 inches. At 300 yards, the distance Tom claimed the old rifle couldn't handle, 4 shots were within 6 inches, and the 5th was only an inch outside that group. "Holy Mary," Roberto muttered. "Where did you learn to shoot like that?" "Dad taught me," Sarah said simply. "He said great-grandfather Miguel was the best shot in his unit during the war. Dad said the rifle knows what to do, you just have to listen to it." Roberto stared at the distant target, then at his granddaughter. An idea began forming in his mind. That evening, Tom and Jake returned from town with news. The annual Pine Ridge shooting competition was coming up in 3 weeks. It was a big event that drew shooters from across the state. Local ranchers, hunters, even some military personnel competed. The winner received a cash prize of $500, more than most ranch hands made in 3 months. "I'm thinking of entering this year," Jake said. "Been practicing with my new rifle. Think I got a real shot at winning." "You'll have some tough competition," Tom replied. "Buck Williams has won 3 of the last 5 years. That man can put a bullet through a dime at 200 yards. "What about you, Roberto?" Jake asked. "You entering?" Roberto smiled mysteriously. "I might enter someone from the ranch. We'll see." The conversation moved on to other topics, but Sarah noticed her grandfather's thoughtful expression. Later that night, as she was getting ready for bed, he knocked on her door. "Sarah," he said, "how would you like to show those boys what that old rifle can really do?" Sarah's eyes widened as she understood what he was suggesting. The Pine Ridge shooting competition. Her against the best shooters in the region. With a rifle Tom and Jake considered practically worthless. "Grandfather, I don't know if I'm good enough for real competition. Mija, I've been around shooters my whole life. What you did today, that wasn't luck. That was skill. Your great-grandfather would be proud." Sarah picked up the old Winchester, running her fingers along its worn stock. She thought about Miguel, arriving in a new country with nothing but hope and this rifle. She thought about her father, teaching her to shoot in the vacant lot behind their Detroit apartment. She thought about Tom and Jake's condescending smiles. "What do we have to do to enter?" she asked. Roberto's grin could have lit up the entire ranch. The next 3 weeks were intensive preparation. Roberto drove Sarah to remote parts of the ranch where she could practice long-distance shooting without Tom and Jake knowing. They worked on different positions: prone, sitting, standing, shooting from various elevations and angles. Roberto shared everything he remembered about competitive shooting, techniques Miguel had taught him years ago. Sarah cleaned and maintained the old Winchester with religious devotion. She tested different types of ammunition, finding the loads that worked best with the rifle's particular characteristics. She practiced in different weather conditions: wind, rain, the thin air of high altitude. Meanwhile, Tom and Jake remained oblivious to what was happening. They continued their good-natured teasing about Sarah's antique rifle, never suspecting she was preparing for something that would change everything. 3 days before the competition, Jake was cleaning his own rifle on the porch when Sarah walked by carrying the Winchester. "Still babying that old relic?" he asked with a grin. "You know, Sarah, there's no shame in getting a modern rifle. I could help you pick out something decent, maybe a nice bolt action in .30-06. Something that could actually hit what you're aiming at." "This one hits what I aim at just fine," Sarah replied calmly.
Tom looked up from the saddle he was mending. Sarah, honey, I know that rifle means something to you because it's family. But sentiment doesn't make up for performance. These mountains will teach you that lesson real quick if you're not careful. Maybe, Sarah said. Or maybe you don't know this rifle as well as you think you do. Something in her tone made both men look at her more carefully, but, before they could respond, she was walking away toward the barn. That night, Roberto told Tom and Jake that he wouldn't need them for the weekend because he was taking Sarah to the shooting competition in town. The competition? Jake looked confused. Why would Sarah be interested in that? She wants to watch, Roberto said with a straight face. Learn something about real shooting. Tom nodded approvingly. That's smart. She'll see what professional level shooting looks like. Might give her some perspective on that old rifle of hers. Might teach her about what real equipment can do, Jake added. I'm planning to show those boys some serious shooting with my new Winchester. Roberto just smiled and said nothing. The morning of the competition, Sarah woke before dawn. Her hands were steady, her mind clear. She had dreamed about Miguel the night before, a dream where he handed her the rifle and said simply, "Make them remember." As she dressed in her best jeans and flannel shirt, Sarah thought about everything that had led to this moment. The loss of her parents, the move to Montana, the weeks of doubt and condescension. All of it had been preparing her for today. She picked up the old Winchester, checking it one more time. The rifle that Tom and Jake dismissed as worthless. The rifle that 3 generations of her family had trusted with their lives and their livelihoods. Time to show them what you can do, old friend, she whispered. Outside, Roberto was loading supplies into the truck. When he saw Sarah with the rifle, his weathered face broke into a proud smile. Ready, Mija? Sarah nodded, climbing into the passenger seat with the Winchester cradled carefully in her arms. As they drove toward town and the competition that would change everything, neither of them spoke much. But both were thinking the same thing: by the end of the day, nobody would be laughing at the old rifle anymore. The sun was rising over the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. It was going to be a beautiful day for shooting. And, for proving that sometimes, the things others mock are exactly what you need to show them who you really are. The Pine Ridge shooting competition was held at Morrison's Field, a large meadow on the outskirts of town that had been converted into a proper shooting range for the weekend. When Sarah and Roberto arrived at 8 in the morning, trucks and cars were already filling the makeshift parking area. Men in hunting clothes and military surplus gear walked around carrying rifle cases, their voices mixing with the sound of targets being set up and range commands being shouted. Sarah felt her stomach tighten as she surveyed the scene. This was bigger than she had imagined. At least 50 competitors had already arrived, and more were coming. She recognized some faces from town, but many were strangers, serious-looking men with expensive equipment and the confident bearing of experienced marksmen. Second thoughts, Mija? Roberto asked softly as they parked the truck. Sarah took a deep breath and shook her head. No. We came this far. They registered at a folding table where a heavy-set man in a sheriff's deputy uniform was checking names and collecting entry fees. When Sarah stepped forward with her $10 entry fee, the deputy looked surprised. You entering, miss? This is a serious competition. We've got some of the best shooters in the state here today. She's serious too, Roberto said firmly, placing his hand on Sarah's shoulder. The deputy shrugged and wrote Sarah's name on the entry list. She was number 37 out of what would eventually be 53 competitors. More importantly, she was the only woman. As they walked toward the staging area where competitors were preparing their equipment, Sarah heard her name being called. She turned to see Jake Morrison jogging toward them, his face lit up with surprise and confusion. Sarah? What are you doing here? Roberto said you just wanted to watch. Before she could answer, Tom Bradley appeared, carrying a rifle case and wearing a look of complete bewilderment. Roberto, what's going on? Why does Sarah have her rifle with her? Roberto's weathered face remained expressionless. She's competing.
Both men stared at him as if he had announced that Sarah was planning to fly to the moon.
Competing?
Tom's voice cracked slightly.
Roberto, this isn't a game.
Some of these guys are former military snipers, professional hunters.
The entry fee alone is $10.
She paid her money like everyone else, Roberto replied calmly.
Jake looked at Sarah with something between concern and embarrassment. Sarah, honey, I don't think you understand what you're getting into.
This competition has 3 stages: precision shooting at known distances, unknown distance shooting, and rapid fire under pressure.
These aren't tin cans in the backyard.
Sarah found her voice.
I know what I'm getting into.
But, that old rifle, Tom began.
We'll do just fine, Sarah interrupted, her voice steady despite the butterflies in her stomach.
Tom and Jake exchanged glances. They were clearly uncomfortable with the situation but didn't want to be rude.
They also didn't want to see Sarah humiliate herself in front of the entire county.
Look, Tom said gently, maybe you could watch this year, learn how it works, and then, next year you could get a proper rifle. And this is a proper rifle, Sarah said, her patience finally wearing thin.
Just because it's old doesn't mean it doesn't work.
A new voice joined the conversation.
What's all the fuss about?
They turned to see Buck Williams approaching. Buck was a legend in the region, a man in his 50s who had won the competition more times than anyone could remember. He was tall and lean, with the patient eyes of someone who had spent decades reading wind and weather. His rifle case was worn leather, expensive but functional. Buck, Tom said, this young lady is Roberto's granddaughter.
She's entered the competition.
Buck's eyes moved to Sarah, then to the old Winchester in her hands.
His expression was unreadable.
First time competing, he asked her directly.
Yes, sir.
That's quite a rifle.
1928 Model 54, isn't it? My grandfather had one just like it. Haven't seen one in active use for years.
Sarah felt a flicker of hope. Finally, someone who recognized the rifle's heritage instead of just dismissing it. But Buck's next words crushed that hope. Of course, that was back when this rifle was considered state-of-the-art. These days. He gestured toward the other competitors with their modern equipment.
Well, let's just say the competition has gotten a lot more sophisticated. He wasn't being mean about it, just stating what he saw as an obvious fact.
Somehow, that made it worse than Tom and Jake's more obvious condescension. Good luck today, young lady, Buck said with a kind but pitying smile.
I hope you learned something.
As Buck walked away, Sarah felt heat rise in her cheeks. Around them, other competitors were setting up their equipment and discussing strategy.
She noticed several men glancing in her direction, some with curiosity, others with barely concealed amusement.
She heard one man say to his companion, "Look at that old Winchester."
Hasn't anyone told her this isn't 1930? Roberto moved closer to Sarah. You don't have to prove anything to these men, Mija. If you want to leave, no.
Sarah's voice was quiet but firm.
I'm not leaving.
She looked around at the sea of modern rifles, expensive scopes, and sophisticated equipment. She thought about Miguel, who had probably faced similar doubts when he first arrived in America with nothing but hope and this same rifle. She thought about her father, who had taught her that it wasn't the equipment that mattered, it was the person holding it. Let's find a good spot to set up, she said. They found a space at the far end of the line of shooting positions. As Sarah unpacked her gear, she was acutely aware of how different her setup looked compared to the others. Where other competitors had elaborate shooting rests, multiple types of ammunition, and complex scopes that looked like they belonged on military equipment, Sarah had the basics: a simple shooting mat, a small bag for steadying the rifle, and 2 boxes of .30-06 ammunition that Roberto had helped her select. The first stage of the competition was precision shooting at known distances. Competitors would fire 5 shots each at targets set at 100, 200, and 300 yards. The targets had scoring rings, with the highest points awarded for hits closest to the center. As the competitors took their positions for the first round, Sarah found herself in the middle of a group of serious-looking men with serious-looking equipment. To her left was a man with a rifle that looked like it belonged in a science fiction movie, complete with a scope that probably cost more than Roberto's truck. To her right was someone she recognized as a local gun store owner who was testing a new rifle he was considering for his shop. The range officer called for the first group to take their positions. Sarah was in the third group, which gave her time to watch the others shoot and get a feel for the conditions. The first shooter was Buck Williams. He moved with the smooth efficiency of long practice, setting up his shooting position like he had done it 1,000 times before. When the range officer called "commence firing," Buck's rifle spoke 5 times in steady, measured intervals. When they checked his target, all 5 shots were clustered in the 10 ring, the highest scoring area.
"That's how you do it," Jake murmured to Tom. "Look at that group.
I bet you could cover all 5 holes with a quarter." Other shooters followed, most achieving respectable scores, a few struggling with the conditions or nerves. Sarah watched everything carefully, noting how the wind was affecting the shots, how different shooters dealt with the pressure. Finally, it was her group's turn. Sarah walked to the firing line with her old Winchester, acutely aware of the whispers and glances from spectators. She set up her shooting mat and settled into position, trying to block out everything except the target 100 yards away. The range officer called out the commands, "Load and make ready. Shooters, you have 10 minutes for 5 shots. Commence firing when ready." Sarah loaded her first round and settled into her shooting position. The rifle felt familiar in her hands, like an extension of herself. She could hear her father's voice, "Don't fight the rifle, Sarah. Work with it. Breathe, relax, squeeze." She took her time with the first shot, feeling for the wind, adjusting for the slight difference in elevation between the firing line and the target. When she was ready, she squeezed the trigger slowly and smoothly. The rifle bucked against her shoulder with its familiar recoil. Through the scope, she could see a small black hole appear in the 9 ring of the target. Not perfect, but solid. Her second shot went into the 10 ring. So did her third and fourth. For her 5th shot, she took extra time, reading the wind, feeling the rifle's balance. When the bullet found the center of the 10 ring, she heard a few surprised murmurs from the spectators. "Not bad for an antique," someone said, but the tone was more respectful than mocking. The 200-yard round went even better. All 5 of Sarah's shots clustered in the 10 ring, creating a group that was competitive with anyone on the line. She was starting to feel the rhythm of the competition, the way the old Winchester responded to different conditions and distances. But it was at 300 yards that things got interesting. This was the distance where Tom had claimed the old rifle would be inadequate. Where Jake had said modern equipment made all the difference. As Sarah settled into position for the long-distance shots, she could feel the weight of skeptical eyes on her. The wind was picking up, creating complex currents that would push bullets off course if not properly accounted for. Sarah watched the flags downrange, noting how the wind shifted at different distances. This was where her weeks of practice with Roberto would pay off, or not. Her first shot at 300 yards hit the 9 ring, just outside the 10. Still a good shot, but not spectacular. Her second shot, however, found the dead center of the 10 ring. So did her third. By now, people were paying attention. Conversations had quieted as spectators focused on the young woman with the old rifle who was shooting lights out at long range. Sarah's 4th shot went into the 10 ring again, creating a cluster that was drawing impressed whistles from other competitors. For her 5th and final shot, she took her time, feeling the wind, adjusting for everything she had learned in 3 weeks of intensive practice. When the shot broke, she knew it was good before the spotter called out X-ring, center. The X-ring was the very center of the 10 ring, the highest possible score. Sarah had just put 5 shots at 300 yards into a group that most of the competitors with their modern rifles couldn't match. As she stood up and safed her rifle, the silence was almost complete. Then, Buck Williams started clapping, slowly at first, then, with genuine enthusiasm. Others joined in until the applause was general. Tom and Jake stood at the back of the crowd, their mouths hanging open. The old rifle they had dismissed as worthless had just outshot most of the modern equipment on the range. But this was only the first stage of the competition.
There were still 2 more events to go, each more challenging than the last. And, as Sarah packed up her shooting gear, she could see some of the other competitors looking at her with new eyes that no longer held pity or amusement, but respect and, maybe a little concern. The young woman with the old rifle wasn't just participating anymore. She was competing. And winning. The crowd began to disperse as competitors prepared for the next stage.
Sarah could hear conversations starting up again, but now they included phrases like "Where did she learn to shoot like that?" and "That old Winchester is shooting better than rifles costing 10 times as much." Roberto appeared at her elbow, his face glowing with pride. "How do you feel, Mija?" Sarah looked at the old Winchester in her hands, then, at the scoreboard where her name was now listed among the top 10 competitors.
"I feel like great-grandfather Miguel is watching," she said. And, somewhere in the distance, she could swear she heard the echo of long-ago laughter, but, this time, it wasn't mocking. It was proud. After the precision shooting stage, competitors had an hour break for lunch while the range officials set up the second stage of the competition. Sarah sat under a large oak tree with Roberto, eating sandwiches his wife Maria had packed that morning. Around them, groups of competitors discussed the morning's shooting, and Sarah couldn't help but notice that many conversations included glances in her direction. The atmosphere had definitely changed. Where before she had been dismissed or ignored, now other shooters were showing genuine interest in her performance. Several had approached to examine the old Winchester more carefully, asking technical questions about the rifle's modifications and ammunition preferences. "That's some fine shooting you did out there," said Carl Henderson, a rancher from the next county over. "Mind if I ask where you learned?"
"Most folks who shoot that well have been at it for decades."
"My father taught me," Sarah replied simply.
"He learned from his grandfather."
Carl nodded with understanding. "Family tradition. That's how the best shooters are made."
Not in competitions, but in quiet moments between generations.
Tom and Jake had been notably quiet during the break. They sat a distance away, occasionally looking over at Sarah with expressions that mixed embarrassment with reluctant admiration. Finally, Tom worked up the courage to approach.
"Sarah," he said, his voice somewhat sheepish, "I owe you an apology.
That shooting this morning, well, it was impressive. Real impressive."
Jake nodded in agreement.
"We underestimated you. And that rifle. I guess old doesn't always mean obsolete."
Sarah looked at both men, seeing genuine respect in their eyes where before there had been condescension.
"Thank you," she said. "But the competition isn't over yet."
"No, it's not," Jake agreed.
"And the next stage is going to be tougher."
Unknown distance shooting separates the good shooters from the great ones.
He was right.
The second stage of the competition was known as Hunter's Challenge, and it was designed to simulate real hunting conditions. Competitors would be presented with targets at unknown distances, ranging anywhere from 150 to 400 yards. They would have to estimate the range, account for terrain and wind, and make first-round hits on targets of varying sizes. Unlike the precision stage where everything was measured and controlled, this stage tested a shooter's field skills, the ability to read conditions, judge distances, and make quick, accurate decisions under pressure. As the lunch break ended, Sarah could see the range officials had set up a completely different course. Instead of the neat, orderly precision range, this looked like natural terrain. Targets were positioned at various distances and elevations, some partially hidden behind trees or rocks, others clearly visible but deceptively far away.
Buck Williams found Sarah as she was preparing her equipment for the second stage.
"That was fine shooting this morning," he said. "Your grandfather would be proud of that rifle's performance."
"Great-grandfather," Sarah corrected. "And, thank you."
Buck studied her face carefully. "You know, I've been shooting competitively for 30 years, and I can count on one hand the number of people who shot as well as you did at 300 yards with a rifle that old.
The question is, can you do it when you don't know the distances?" It was a fair question, and Sarah knew it.
Precision shooting with known distances was one thing you could prepare, calculate, and take your time. Unknown distance shooting required instincts, experience, and the ability to read terrain like a book.
"I guess we'll find out," Sarah said.
Buck smiled, but it was no longer the condescending smile from that morning.
I guess we will. Good luck, young lady. You're going to need it. The second stage worked differently from the first.
Instead of all competitors shooting simultaneously, they would take turns, moving through the course individually while being scored by range officials. Sarah drew number 15, which meant she would shoot roughly in the middle of the group. This gave her the advantage of watching other competitors tackle the course first, learning from their successes and mistakes. She positioned herself where she could observe the shooting while still preparing mentally for her own turn. The first few competitors struggled with the unknown distances. A military veteran who had dominated the precision stage misjudged the range to a 350-yard target and shot over the top. A local hunter who was favored to win missed 3 out of 5 targets, apparently thrown off by the unfamiliar angles and lighting conditions. Buck Williams, shooting 7th, demonstrated why he was considered the master of this event. He moved through the course with practiced efficiency, taking time to study each target, using natural reference points to estimate distances, and making clean hits on 4 out of 5 targets. Only a particularly tricky shot through a gap in the trees gave him trouble.
That's how you do it, someone in the crowd murmured.
Buck knows these mountains like the back of his hand. When Sarah's turn came, she walked to the starting position with the old Winchester slung across her shoulder. The range officer explained the course: 5 targets at unknown distances, 1 shot at each, scored on a hit or miss basis with bonus points for shots in the center rings. Take your time to study each shot, the range officer advised. But, remember, in a real hunting situation, you don't get multiple chances.
Make your shot count. Sarah nodded and began moving through the course. The first target was the most straightforward, a large silhouette positioned in an open meadow. The challenge was judging the distance without any obvious reference points.
Sarah studied the target carefully, using techniques Roberto had taught her. She looked for visual cues: the apparent size of the target, the way heat waves were affecting the air, the clarity of details she could see through her scope. Based on the size of the target and her experience shooting at Roberto's ranch, she estimated the range at approximately 220 yards. She settled into a shooting position, adjusted her point of aim to account for the estimated distance, and took the shot. Through her scope, she could see the bullet strike the target just left of center, a solid hit that drew a satisfied nod from the range officer.
The second target was more challenging.
It was positioned on a hillside above her, partially obscured by brush, at what appeared to be a significantly longer range. Sarah moved to a position where she could get a better angle, studying the terrain and trying to pick out reference points that would help her judge the distance. This was where her weeks of practice at various elevations around Roberto's ranch paid dividends. She had learned to read the subtle visual cues that indicated when a target was further away than it appeared. The target looked close, but the way the sunlight was hitting it and the lack of detail she could make out suggested it was probably around 300 yards, maybe a bit more. Sarah took a prone shooting position, using her pack to steady the rifle. The uphill angle would require her to adjust her point of aim, shooting slightly low to compensate for the trajectory. She took her time, feeling for the wind, adjusting for what she hoped was the correct range estimation. The shot felt good when it broke. Through her scope, she could see she had hit the target, though not as close to center as she would have liked. Still, it was a hit, and, at unknown distance, that was what mattered. The third target proved to be the most difficult so far. It was positioned in shadow at the edge of a tree line, making it nearly invisible except for occasional glimpses when the wind moved the branches. Sarah spent several minutes just trying to get a clear view of what she was supposed to shoot at. When she finally spotted the target clearly, she realized why it was giving everyone trouble. It wasn't just the concealment, the target was also smaller than the others and positioned at what appeared to be maximum range for the course. Sarah found a shooting position that gave her the best angle through the trees. She estimated the range at close to 400 yards, maybe a bit less, but the shadows and intervening vegetation made it difficult to be certain. This was the kind of shot that separated experienced field shooters from range shooters. She thought about her great-grandfather Miguel, who had probably faced similar challenges hunting in the mountains of Mexico and later in Montana. The old Winchester had taken game at long range in difficult conditions. It could do the same today. Sarah settled into her shooting position, found the target in her scope, and waited for a moment when the wind moved the branches to give her a clear shot. When the opportunity came, she took it. The target was so far away and so obscured that she couldn't immediately tell if she had hit or missed. The range officer was watching through binoculars, and, after what seemed like an eternity, he nodded and called out hit. The fourth target returned to more straightforward shooting. It was clearly visible at what appeared to be medium range, maybe 250 yards. The challenge was that it was positioned on a steep downhill slope, requiring her to compensate for the angle. Downhill shots were tricky because bullets tend to hit high when shooting down at steep angles. Sarah had practiced this scenario with Roberto, and she remembered his advice: the steeper the angle, the more you aim low. She estimated the distance at 250 yards but aimed as if the target were only 220 yards away, compensating for the downhill angle. The shot was clean, striking the target near the center ring. The fifth and final target was designed to test nerves as much as skill. It was positioned at moderate range, probably around 200 yards, but it was small and partially concealed behind rocks. More challenging still, this was the shot everyone would be watching, knowing it could make or break a competitor's score. Sarah took her time studying the target and the conditions. The wind had picked up slightly, and she could see dust being blown around near the target area. She would need to account for that crosswind. She settled into her final shooting position, focused on the target through her scope, and tried to block out the awareness of all the people watching. This was just her and the rifle and the target, the same as thousands of practice shots with her father in Detroit and with Roberto in Montana. The shot felt perfect when it broke, the trigger squeeze smooth, the follow-through clean, the rifle's recoil straight back against her shoulder. Through her scope, she could see the bullet had struck the target well within the scoring rings. Hit, center ring, called the range officer, and Sarah heard applause from the spectators. As she walked back to the starting area, Sarah felt a mixture of relief and satisfaction. She had hit all 5 targets, matching Buck Williams's performance and doing better than most of the other competitors. But, more than that, she had proven something to herself. The precision shooting stage had shown that she could shoot accurately under controlled conditions. This stage had proven that she could apply those skills in realistic field conditions, reading terrain and wind and making shots that required judgment as much as marksmanship. Tom and Jake were waiting for her when she finished, and both men looked genuinely impressed. 5 for 5, Tom said, shaking his head in amazement. And some of those were shots I wouldn't have wanted to attempt. That third target, Jake added, half the competitors missed that one entirely. How did you even see it through all that brush? You learn to look for what's there instead of what isn't, Sarah replied, echoing something her father had once told her. Buck Williams approached as she was cleaning her rifle. Outstanding shooting, he said, and there was no condescension left in his voice at all. You handled that course like someone who's been hunting these mountains for years. Thank you, sir. Buck studied the old Winchester with new interest. You know, I'm starting to think I underestimated that rifle of yours. It's not the equipment that matters, is it? It's the person behind it. Sarah smiled. That's what my father always said. As the scores were tallied and posted, Sarah found herself in second place overall, just behind Buck Williams and well ahead of most competitors with much more expensive equipment. The whispered conversations around her had completely changed in tone. Who is that girl? Where did she learn to shoot like that? That old rifle is outperforming everything else on the range. But Sarah knew the real test was still to come. The third and final stage of the competition would be rapid fire under pressure, a test not just of accuracy, but of speed, mental focus, and the ability to perform when everything was on the line. And, based on the way some of the other competitors were looking at her now, she had the feeling they weren't going to underestimate her anymore. The afternoon sun was beginning to slant through the mountains when the range officials announced the third and final stage of the competition. The rapid-fire event was scheduled to begin at 3 o'clock, giving competitors time to rest, hydrate, and prepare mentally for what many considered the most challenging part of the contest. Sarah sat in the shade of Roberto's truck, cleaning the old Winchester methodically.
After 2 stages of competition, the rifle was warm to the touch and showed slight traces of fouling from repeated firing. She wanted everything perfect for the final stage. "How are you feeling, Mija?" Roberto asked, settling down beside her. "Nervous," Sarah admitted. "The rapid fire is different from anything I've practiced." It was true.
While she had spent weeks preparing for precision and unknown distance shooting, the rapid-fire stage was something entirely new.
Competitors would face multiple targets appearing at random intervals, requiring them to engage each target quickly and accurately before moving to the next.
It was designed to simulate the pressure of real hunting situations where split-second decisions meant the difference between success and failure.
"Tell me about this stage," Sarah said to Roberto. "You've watched it before." Roberto nodded thoughtfully. "It's meant to test how you shoot under pressure. They'll set up 5 or 6 targets at different distances, but you won't know which one will be activated first. When a target appears, you have maybe 10 seconds to identify it, range it, and take your shot before it disappears again." Sarah felt her stomach tighten. 10 seconds to do what she had been taking minutes to accomplish in the previous stages. "The key," Roberto continued, "is to stay calm. Don't let the time pressure make you rush the important things: sight picture, breathing, trigger control. Better to miss one target because you took time to shoot the others well than to miss them all because you panicked." Around them, other competitors were making similar preparations.
Sarah noticed that several were switching to different rifles for this stage: lighter, faster handling guns that could be swung quickly from target to target. Buck Williams, however, was sticking with the same rifle he had used all day, apparently confident in his ability to handle any challenge with his chosen equipment. Tom Bradley approached their little camp, carrying a can of soda and wearing an expression of concern.
"Sarah," he said, "I've been thinking about this final stage. It's going to be different from what you've been doing. Maybe you should consider this. I've got a lever-action Winchester in my truck. It's lighter than that bolt-action of yours, faster to operate. Might give you a better chance in the rapid fire."
It was a generous offer, and Sarah could see that Tom was genuinely trying to help.
But she shook her head. "Thank you, but no. I've come this far with great-grandfather's rifle. I'm not switching now."
Tom looked like he wanted to argue but then nodded slowly.
"I understand. Well, don't feel bad if this stage doesn't go as well as the others. Rapid fire is a different skill entirely." After Tom left, Jake Morrison appeared.
He had been eliminated after the second stage, having struggled with the unknown distances, but he was staying to watch the finals.
"Sarah," he said, "I wanted to apologize again for this morning. What you've done today, it's opened my eyes. That rifle, your shooting, I was wrong about both." "Thank you, Jake.
But I'm going to give you the same advice I give anyone going into rapid fire.
Don't overthink it. Trust your instincts. You've proven you have the skills. Now you just need to let them work." As 3 o'clock approached, the officials called the remaining competitors to the firing line.
After 2 stages of elimination, only 12 shooters remained for the final event. Sarah was still in second place overall, but the points were close enough that a strong performance in rapid fire could move her into first, or a poor performance could drop her out of the top 5 entirely.
The rapid fire range looked like something from a shooting gallery.
6 targets were positioned at various distances and angles, each controlled by a mechanical system that could raise or lower them on command. The targets varied in size, some large and easy to see, others smaller and more challenging. The distances ranged from what appeared to be about 100 yards to possibly 300 yards or more. Buck Williams, as the leader after 2 stages, would shoot last. Sarah, in second place, would shoot second to last. This meant she would have the advantage of watching most of the other competitors attempt the course, but it also meant she would feel the pressure of knowing exactly what score she needed to beat. The first competitor was Carl Henderson, the rancher who had complemented Sarah's family shooting tradition during lunch. Carl was a steady, methodical shooter who had performed well in the first 2 stages. But, as he took his position at the firing line, Sarah could see the tension in his shoulders. "Shooter ready," called the range officer. Ready, Carl replied.
Stand by, targets.
The first target popped up at medium range, clearly visible and relatively large. Carl swung his rifle to it smoothly and took his shot.
The target fell, indicating a hit.
But the second target appeared almost immediately at long range, and Carl seemed to struggle with the transition.
His shot went wide, missing entirely.
The third target appeared at close range, and Carl, apparently flustered by his miss, rushed the shot and missed again. By the time the course was finished, Carl had hit only 2 out of 6 targets, a disappointing performance that dropped him out of contention.
The next several competitors showed similar patterns.
The time pressure and rapid target transitions were clearly affecting even experienced shooters. A few managed 4 hits out of 6, which seemed to be a respectable score. One competitor, a young military veteran, managed 5 hits but took so long on each shot that he ran out of time before engaging the final target. Buck Williams watched each performance carefully, studying the target sequence and timing. When his turn came, he moved to the firing line with the calm confidence of someone who had done this many times before.
Shooter ready?
Ready.
Stand by, targets. Buck's performance was a clinic in rapid-fire shooting.
He engaged each target smoothly and efficiently, taking just enough time to ensure accurate shot placement without rushing. His rifle seemed to flow from target to target like an extension of his body. When the course was finished, Buck had hit 5 out of 6 targets, missing only a particularly challenging shot at maximum range. It was a score that would be very difficult to beat. As Buck walked back from the firing line to scattered applause, Sarah realized that she needed to hit at least 5 targets to have a chance of winning, and probably all 6 to guarantee first place. The mathematics were simple, but the execution would be anything but.
"Martinez, you're up," called the range officer.
Sarah walked to the firing line, carrying the old Winchester that had carried her family through 3 generations and 2 stages of competition. She could feel the weight of everyone's attention on her, not just the competitors and officials, but the growing crowd of spectators who had heard about the young woman with the antique rifle. She took her position and checked her rifle one final time. The bolt worked smoothly, the scope was clear, and the familiar weight felt balanced in her hands.
Shooter ready? Sarah took a deep breath, thinking about everything that had led to this moment.
Her parents' death, the move to Montana, weeks of doubt and preparation, the morning's precision shooting, the afternoon's unknown distances. All of it had been leading to this.
Ready. Stand by. Time seemed to slow down.
Sarah could hear her own heartbeat, feel the slight breeze on her face, sense the tension in the crowd behind her. Targets. The first target appeared at what looked like 150 yards, large and clearly visible. Sarah swung the rifle smoothly to it, found the target in her scope, and fired. The target dropped immediately. The second target popped up before she had fully recovered from the first shot. It was smaller and, at longer range, maybe 250 yards. Sarah worked the bolt action quickly, chambering a fresh round, and swung to the new target.
She forced herself to take an extra half second to ensure proper sight alignment before firing. Another hit.
The third target was the most challenging yet small, at extreme range, and positioned at an angle that required her to shoot across her body. Sarah pivoted her entire shooting position, found the target in her scope, and realized she was running out of time.
She could hear the range officer beginning to count down the final seconds.
She fired just as the target was beginning to disappear. Through her scope, she saw it fall.
The fourth target appeared immediately at close range.
After the long shot, the transition was jarring, and Sarah had to fight the urge to rush. She worked the bolt, found the target, and fired. Hit. Target 5 was at medium range but partially concealed behind a screen that made it difficult to see clearly.
Sarah had to take precious time to identify exactly where to aim.
When she fired, she wasn't sure if she had hit or missed until she saw the target fall.
5 hits out of 5.
She was ahead of Buck Williams's pace, but there was still one target to go. The final target appeared at maximum range, probably close to 300 yards, and it was the smallest target on the course. Sarah could barely see it through her scope, just a small dark shape against the distant hillside. She worked the bolt one final time, chambering her last round. This was it, everything came down to this shot. Sarah found the target in her scope and realized that at this distance, with this small a target, she would need perfect conditions and a perfect shot. The wind had picked up slightly, and she could see it affecting the grass near the target. She held high and, slightly left to account for the wind, took her breath, let half of it out, and began her trigger squeeze. The shot broke cleanly, and Sarah held her position, watching through the scope for any indication of whether she had hit or missed.
For a moment, nothing happened. Then, almost in slow motion, the distant target fell. 6 hits out of 6. Perfect score. The silence that followed was complete, as if the entire crowd was holding its breath.
Then, someone started clapping, and, suddenly, everyone was applauding: competitors, officials, spectators, everyone.
Buck Williams was the first to reach her, his face showing genuine admiration and respect.
"Outstanding shooting," he said, extending his hand. "I've never seen anyone shoot rapid fire like that with a bolt-action rifle."
Most people would have said it was impossible.
Tom and Jake were there moments later, both talking at once.
6 for 6.
I can't believe what I just saw.
That last shot, how did you even see the target at that distance?
But it was Roberto's face that meant the most to Sarah. Her grandfather was crying, not from sadness, but from pride so deep it couldn't be contained. "Mija," he said softly, "your great-grandfather is smiling down on us today." As the final scores were tallied, Sarah found herself not just in first place, but winning by a significant margin. Her perfect rapid-fire performance, combined with strong showings in the first 2 stages, had given her a decisive victory over some of the best shooters in the region. When the officials called her name as the winner of the Pine Ridge shooting competition, Sarah walked forward to accept the trophy and the $500 prize money. But, more than the trophy or the money, what mattered was the look of respect in every face she saw. The old rifle that had been mocked that morning was now being examined with reverence by competitors who wanted to understand how it had outperformed equipment costing 10 times as much. "It's not about the rifle," Buck Williams said to a group of admirers.
"It's about the shooter.
This young lady has a gift, and she's put in the work to develop it." As the sun began to set over the Montana mountains, Sarah stood with the old Winchester in her hands and the winner's trophy at her feet, surrounded by people who now saw her not as a city girl playing with her grandfather's antique, but as a shooter who had earned her place among the best. The laughter from that morning, the dismissive chuckles and condescending comments, was gone completely. In its place was something much better: respect earned through performance, recognition gained through skill, and the knowledge that sometimes the old ways are still the best ways. But, even as she celebrated with Roberto and accepted congratulations from her former doubters, Sarah knew that this was more than just winning a competition. It was about honoring the legacy of 3 generations of her family, proving that Miguel's rifle was as capable today as it had been when he first carried it across the border all those years ago. The old Winchester had spoken, and its voice was clear and true. The celebration after the competition stretched well into the evening. What had started as a formal award ceremony evolved into an impromptu gathering at Murphy's Diner, the only restaurant in Pine Ridge large enough to accommodate the crowd of competitors, officials, and spectators who wanted to continue the day's discussions. Sarah sat at a corner table with Roberto, still holding the winner's trophy and trying to process everything that had happened. The $500 in prize money was more than she had ever possessed at one time, but it was the transformation in how people treated her that felt most significant. Throughout the evening, shooter after shooter approached their table. Some wanted to examine the old Winchester more closely. Others asked about her training methods or her family's shooting traditions. A few offered genuine apologies for their earlier dismissiveness. Buck Williams, who had finished second, seemed particularly interested in the rifle's history. He sat with Sarah and Roberto for nearly an hour, listening to stories about Miguel's immigration from Mexico and the role the Winchester had played in the family's survival in a new country. "You know," Buck said, turning the rifle over in his hands with careful reverence, "I've been shooting competitively for 30 years, and I've never seen anything quite like what you did today. It wasn't just the accuracy, it was the way you read conditions, adapted to different challenges, stayed calm under pressure. That's not something you can teach.
That's instinct, developed over generations.
My great-grandfather always said the rifle remembers, Sarah replied. Every shot fired through it, every lesson learned with it.
He said if you listen, it will teach you. Buck nodded thoughtfully.
I think your great-grandfather was a wise man. And I think he'd be very proud of what you accomplished today. As the evening wore on, Sarah found herself the center of attention in ways that would have been unimaginable that morning. Jake Morrison, who had struggled through the competition with his expensive new rifle, was particularly interested in her shooting techniques. I keep thinking about that rapid-fire stage, he said. You were using a bolt-action rifle against people with semi-automatics and lever guns.
By all logic, you should have been at a disadvantage. How did you make it work? Sarah considered the question carefully. I think it's because I know this rifle so well.
Every movement is automatic, working the bolt, finding the target, controlling my breathing.
When you're completely familiar with your equipment, you don't have to think about the mechanics. You can focus entirely on the shooting.
Tom Bradley, who had offered to let Sarah use his lever-action rifle, shook his head in amazement. I was trying to help, but I was really suggesting you abandon the thing that made you successful in the first place. That old Winchester isn't just a rifle to you, it's part of your family.
It is, Sarah agreed. And maybe that's why it shoots so well for me. It's not just a tool. It's a connection to everyone who came before me.
Word of Sarah's victory had spread beyond the immediate competition community. A reporter from the regional newspaper arrived at Murphy's Diner around 9 o'clock, wanting to write a story about the young woman who had won the state's most prestigious shooting competition with a rifle older than most of the competitors.
Miss Martinez, the reporter asked, what would you say to people who claim that modern equipment is always superior to older designs?
Sarah thought about the question while sipping coffee from a mug that probably dated to the same era as her rifle. I'd say that quality doesn't have an expiration date, she replied.
Great-grandfather Miguel chose that rifle because it was well-made and reliable. Those qualities don't disappear just because newer models come along. Sometimes the old ways work because they've been tested by time and experience. Do you plan to compete again? The reporter asked.
I don't know, Sarah said honestly. Today was about proving something to myself and to others.
Whether I compete again depends on what challenges come next.
As the crowd at Murphy's Diner gradually thinned out, Sarah and Roberto prepared for the long drive back to the ranch. The old Winchester was secured in its case, the trophy was wrapped carefully in a towel, and the prize money was safely tucked into Roberto's wallet. But, before they could leave, one final visitor approached their table. It was a woman in her 60s with silver hair and intelligent eyes, dressed in practical clothes that suggested she was familiar with outdoor activities.
Miss Martinez, she said, I'm Helen Crawford from the Montana Wildlife Federation.
I watched your performance today, and I wanted to speak with you about something. Sarah and Roberto exchanged glances. The Montana Wildlife Federation was a respected organization that promoted hunting, conservation, and outdoor education throughout the state. We're always looking for people who can serve as ambassadors for our sport, Helen continued. People who can demonstrate that shooting sports are about skill, tradition, and respect for our heritage. After what I saw today, I think you might be exactly the kind of person we need. She explained that the Federation sponsored youth shooting programs, organized women's hunting clinics, and worked to preserve the outdoor traditions that had built Montana. They were looking for someone who could serve as a spokesperson and instructor, traveling to schools and community groups to teach shooting skills and outdoor ethics. It would be part-time at first, Helen said, but it pays well, and it would give you a platform to share your family's traditions with the next generation.
What do you think? Sarah looked at Roberto, who nodded encouragingly. I'd be interested in learning more, Sarah said.
Helen smiled and handed Sarah her business card.
Wonderful. Call me next week, and we'll discuss the details. I have a feeling this could be the beginning of something special.
The drive home through the mountains was mostly quiet, both Sarah and Roberto lost in their own thoughts about the day's events. The old truck's headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the familiar curves and landmarks of the road they had traveled that morning with such different expectations.
Mija, Roberto said finally, I want you to know how proud I am. Not just of your shooting, but of how you carried yourself today. You showed them who you are without losing who you've always been. I keep thinking about great-grandfather Miguel, Sarah replied. How he must have felt when people doubted him because he was different, because his ways were unfamiliar. Today felt like I was honoring his memory. You were, Roberto said firmly. And he was with you. I could feel it, especially during that final rapid-fire stage. That wasn't just skill, that was 3 generations of knowledge flowing through you. When they finally reached the ranch, the windows were glowing with warm light. Roberto's wife Maria had stayed up waiting for them, and she rushed out to greet them as soon as she heard the truck. How did it go? She called out before they were even fully out of the vehicle. Roberto held up the trophy, grinning broadly. Your granddaughter just won the state shooting championship. Maria's hands flew to her mouth in surprise and delight. She embraced Sarah tightly, then stepped back to examine the trophy with wonder. I knew it, she said finally. From the moment you arrived with Miguel's rifle, I knew you were special. That rifle has been waiting 60 years for the right person to shoot it again. They stayed up late into the night, sharing the details of the competition with Maria and planning for Sarah's future. The conversation with Helen Crawford had opened up possibilities that Sarah had never considered. She could use her shooting skills not just for personal achievement, but to teach others and preserve the traditions that meant so much to her family. The next morning, Sarah woke early and walked out to the shooting range that Roberto had set up behind the ranch house. She carried the old Winchester, wanting to spend some quiet time with it after the excitement of the previous day. As she settled into a familiar shooting position, looking at targets that had helped her prepare for the competition, Sarah thought about how much had changed in just 24 hours. Yesterday morning, she had been dismissed as a city girl with an obsolete rifle. Today, she was a champion with opportunities she had never imagined. But, more than that, she had proven something important about the value of tradition and the strength that comes from honoring the past while embracing the future. The old Winchester had not just won a competition, it had validated a way of life and a set of values that connected her to her heritage. Sarah loaded 5 rounds and settled in for some practice shooting. Not because she needed to prove anything more, but because this is what Martinez women did. They maintained their skills, honored their traditions, and stayed ready for whatever challenges life might present. As her first shot rang out across the Montana morning, echoing off the distant mountains, Sarah smiled. Somewhere, she knew, Miguel was smiling too. The old rifle had spoken again, and its message was clear: some things are too valuable to be dismissed, too proven to be doubted, and too important to be forgotten. 3 months later, Sarah received a letter that would change her life again. It was from the United States Olympic Committee, inviting her to try out for the national shooting team. Someone at the Montana Wildlife Federation had submitted her competition results, along with a recommendation from Buck Williams and several other prominent shooters. The letter mentioned that the Olympics were looking for shooters who could compete in multiple disciplines, and that Sarah's performance with a bolt-action rifle and rapid-fire competition had attracted attention from national coaches. As Sarah read the letter on the porch where she had first been mocked for her old rifle, she thought about the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a grieving teenage orphan to a state champion to a potential Olympian, all because she had refused to abandon the things that mattered most to her. She looked at the old Winchester, now displayed in a place of honor above the fireplace, and knew exactly what Miguel would tell her to do. Roberto, she called to her grandfather, who was working in the garden, how do you feel about taking a trip to Colorado Springs? The United States Olympic Training Center was about to meet a young woman who would show them that sometimes the old ways are not just as good as the new ways, sometimes they're better. And, in a display case at the training center, right next to the most modern shooting equipment money could buy, an old Winchester Model 54 would soon take its place as the rifle that proved that tradition, respect, and family legacy are the most powerful tools any competitor can possess. The laughter had indeed vanished by dawn. In its place was something much more lasting, the recognition that greatness comes not from having the newest equipment or following the latest trends, but from understanding who you are, honoring where you came from, and having the courage to prove that the things others dismiss might be exactly what you need to achieve the impossible. Sarah Martinez had learned that lesson on a shooting range in Montana,
but it was a lesson that would serve her well no matter where her journey led next. The old rifle had taught her that the most important victories are not just about winning competitions, they're about winning respect for the values and traditions that make us who we are. And, in a world that often seems eager to discard the old in favor of the new, that may be the most important lesson of all.